Our top 10 science stories of 2015 include a wide variety of science disciplines. We have several members of our education team here to tell us more. I'm Susan.
I'm George.
I'm Julia.
I'm Eric.
I'm Lucy.
And I'm Corrine.
We'll start with our number 10 story and work our way up to number 1. And here to tell us about the number 10 science story of 2015 is Julia.
This one is about advances in desalinating ocean water to make it drinkable fresh water. In Israel, they just opened the 4th and largest desalination plant, and now Israel gets 40% of its fresh water from treating seawater.
Wow, that's really impressive. What kind of technology are they using to do this?
They're using reverse osmosis. So I'll compare that really quick to another method, which is distillation. That's where you boil the salt water and then condense the steam, and that leaves the salt behind. But that uses a lot of energy to boil the water. This other process they're using, reverse osmosis, you just shove the seawater at high pressure through a special membrane. In the past, this has been less efficient because the membranes were more delicate, but membranes have improved, so they still do the job of keeping the salt out, but they're also stronger, so they can be used with wider diameter pipes, and that helps the whole system process more seawater using less energy. So that makes it now efficient enough that it's affordable to get your fresh water from seawater using reverse osmosis.
That's great. Are they planning to use that anywhere else?
Yes, the same company that built that one in Israel has also just finished building one in the San Diego area. Because, of course, California has been very low on surface water and groundwater lately. So desalination could help them meet their water needs. But it would take a lot of these desalination plants to even get close to meeting California's needs. This new one, which cost $1 billion to build, will cover 8% of San Diego's water needs.
Well, that's a good start.
Yeah.
And hopefully with more improvements and better cost efficiency, maybe they can get more water to California.
Yeah. For our number 9 science story, I will turn it over to George.
Our number 9 story this year is net neutrality. And when I first heard about net neutrality, I thought that it might have something to do with censorship or what we're allowed to reach on the internet and how we access data. But it has to do with how that data gets to us. Net neutrality is here to make sure that everyone has equal access to data and that it's all delivered to us at the same speeds. Without net neutrality, there's sort of this worst case scenario where internet service providers like Comcast and RCN could split the internet into 2 separate tiers. So have sort of a fast lane, and by fast I mean the same speeds we get now, and an artificially slowed down lane. So you would have the big companies, the established ones, like say a Netflix and a Hulu that can afford a premium to use the fast lane, where you would have the startup companies that wouldn't be able to afford the fast lane, having to use the much slower lane to reach their consumers. This year, the FCC passed regulations so that the internet service providers can't block, slow down artificially, or prioritize data. So it means that all companies have the same access to the consumers. It's one of the big things that keeps the internet a fair playing ground, because it means everyone, regardless of how much money they are, how established they are, can afford to deliver their content at the same speeds.
Great. I'm glad they're not regulating what I can and can't see on the internet, but making sure that I can see it at whatever speed I want. Our number 8 story, we go to space, and Eric.
So the big news from NASA earlier this year was that water was discovered on Mars. That's liquid water, not frozen ice, on today's Mars. So we know Mars had liquid oceans and lakes maybe 1 billion years ago.
Isn't it kind of too cold to have liquid water?
It's extremely cold on Mars, so it wouldn't be water the same way as we know it here on the Earth. We really have to look for the signature of what water leaves behind. So the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter has been at Mars for almost 10 years now, taking really detailed maps of the surface, and it has instruments that can look at the chemistry of the rocks on Mars from orbit. So they found these lines on Mars that would occur only during the warmest times. They would show up on slopes, so the theory was that this was water flowing downhill during the warm summer months, and then those lines would disappear when it got cold.
But what's warm on Mars? It's still way below freezing.
Right, a warm summer day on Mars, you were talking about maybe 95 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit.
Wow, how could water possibly be liquid at that temperature?
The same principle that lets you scatter salt on your driveway to melt the ice by lowering the freezing temperature happens when salt is mixed together with water. And so on Mars, we're seeing very briny, salty water flowing down these hills, leaving behind these depressions. And that Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter was able to see the chemical signature of salts called perchlorates. When they're mixed together with water, it lowers the freezing point dramatically, so you can have liquid water even at extremely cold temperatures.
That's really exciting to have liquid water on Mars and makes you think even more about the possibility of life potentially being on Mars.
And now, let's go to Julia for our number 7 story this year.
This story is the magnitude 7.8 earthquake that happened in Nepal in April. Nepal is right on the boundary between two tectonic plates that have been colliding slowly for millions of years. So they have had a lot of earthquakes there. This one killed about 9,000 people. It also caused avalanches on Mount Everest that killed some climbers. But even though it was very damaging, it wasn't as damaging as one might expect. And studying the data after the earthquake showed that the surface shaking, so like the wiggling of the ground parallel to the ground surface, was at a slower rate than most of the earthquakes in that area. Just a little bit slower rate.
The rate of shaking might have been different, but it was still a huge earthquake. How does the rate affect the damage?
Yeah, the magnitude tells you that that this earthquake released a lot of energy, but the way that the ground shakes can cause variety in the kind of damage. So in this case, the slower rate of ground shaking seemed to make it more likely for the tallest buildings to be damaged, and shorter buildings were less affected by the shaking. So some really ancient tall monuments that had stood through many previous earthquakes, they collapsed in this one. But the buildings that had the people in them didn't collapse as much, so that was fortunate.
Well, hopefully studying this earthquake will lead us to better understand earthquakes in this part of the world in the future and earthquakes in general. And our number 6 story, Susan is going to talk about bacteria communicating with each other.
We're learning more and more now about the importance of bacteria in our human everyday lives. And so it's becoming more important to study how they may interact with each other. And we never really thought of bacteria as being able to communicate with each other, so kind of telling each other what to do or what they might need. And experiments done this year are showing, in fact, that they can communicate with each other in a process similar to the way our nerve cells might communicate with each other by using electrochemical signals. So the experiment they did looked at growing bacteria on a plate of food. And as the bacteria colony ate the food, they grew, used up more of the food, and those bacteria that were towards the center of the colony, well, they weren't getting as much food as the bacteria on the outside of the colony. And so the ones on the inside sent an electrochemical signal to those on the outside, which prevented the ones on the outside from eating. So it wasn't quite, hey, Joe, stop eating. I need some food in here. But it was a signal that the outer bacteria reacted to. They stopped eating, and then there was more food for the bacteria on the inner part. When the inner ones were fed again, they stopped sending out that signal and allowed the ones on the outside to eat again.
So this communication lets the whole colony stay healthy.
Yeah, it's actual communication between bacteria, which seemed like they were too simplistic of organisms to be able to do something like that.
Well, now they're going to need to study a lot of other bacterial colonies to see how common this communication is.
Absolutely, yeah. They only did it in one form, and to see, do all bacteria communicate like this? Our number 5 story is about weather and climate, and we were originally going to be talking about El Nino, and we'll get to that in a second. But just a couple days ago, as of recording this podcast, the COP21 climate conference just finished in Paris. Julia, can you tell us a little bit about the results of that conference?
Delegates from 195 nations made an agreement. Different nations are pledging to reduce their carbon emissions to different degrees depending on what that country can handle. The pledges are not binding, but it is built in to revisit and revise those pledges in the future as technology improves. So we hope that the pledges will get more ambitious with time. But it is exciting to see participation across so many countries.
And we're very cognizant of climate change because it affects our weather and things like El Nino, which is our original number 5 story for the year. So Lucy, what is El Nino and how did it affect us this year?
Well, El Nino is a phenomenon that affects the Pacific Ocean, but it has some implications for other parts of the world. But essentially, in a non-El Nino year, we've got these strong trade winds that blow across the Pacific Ocean, and they push with it the warm surface water. And so they push that warm surface water over to the coast of Indonesia and Australia and the Western Pacific, and a cooler pool of water is over by the coast of South America. In an El Nino year, those trade winds either die down or reverse completely and keep or push that warm water closer towards the coast of South America.
And so we're seeing a very strong El Nino effect this year?
Yes, one of the strongest.
And why do we care about that? How does that affect us or our weather?
Well, that warm ocean water is really a hotbed for hurricanes, tropical cyclones to form. So when we see warm ocean water over by the coast of South America, we see an increase in hurricanes forming in the eastern Pacific. It also has implications for the Atlantic Ocean because it will generally mean we get fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean. So this year, we saw the strongest hurricane measured in terms of wind speed that we've ever seen, Hurricane Patricia. Hurricane Patricia made landfall in Mexico in October of this year and was a Category 5 hurricane. Hurricane Patricia had wind speeds of 200 miles an hour. That is incredibly strong, the strongest we've ever seen in a hurricane.
Well, I wonder what that's going to mean for our winter.
Well, El Nino definitely affects our global weather patterns, but we're not entirely sure what it means for this winter.
Fingers crossed it's better than last winter. So our number 4 story is about gene editing and new technologies that make this a lot easier and better, and raise some questions about how we should use this technology.
2015 saw a huge increase in the amount of DNA editing, primarily to do with a specific type of technology called CRISPR. CRISPR was not invented in 2015, but it became a lot more prevalent, and not just in large-scale laboratories editing DNA, but even in neighborhood and community labs and smaller laboratories as well. So CRISPR is a technique where scientists are able to take a piece of DNA that gives information on how a cell is to make something, and is able to put it in a very specific way into another organism's DNA. For example, being able to take the DNA for how a human cell would make insulin and putting it into a bacterium so that those bacteria can then crank out human insulin for people to use.
But bacteria aren't the only thing we're using this technology for.
No, and that's an excellent point, Corinne. People are using this technique to do things like edit mosquitoes, for example, and preventing mosquitoes from being able to carry deadly diseases or transmit deadly diseases like malaria or yellow fever. But once you make these mosquitoes, in order to affect human diseases out in the world, well, you have to release these edited mosquitoes into the wild. And a lot of people have concerns over what that might do to ecological systems.
So you can imagine going a step further.
If we're using this in mosquitoes, can we use it in humans?
Absolutely, this can be used in humans, technically. But a lot of scientists are talking about, should we use it in humans? And what type of implications does that have? What if we can cure certain diseases or prevent them from ever happening? But using a new technology like this, we're not entirely sure of what the repercussions might be. So this year's number 4 story is not just the DNA editing technique, but the ethical issues that scientists are discussing surrounding this technique.
Sounds like it's one of those cases where technology can outpace the regulations that go along with it. So we have some hard thinking to do about this subject. Our number 3 story has to do with quantum mechanics and a phenomenon called entanglement. So Corrine, what are we talking about here?
So this year, an experiment was done that confirmed this mind-bending idea in quantum mechanics that we call quantum entanglement.
Quantum entanglement? Albert Einstein said that can't possibly be true.
To explain what quantum entanglement actually is, we need to leave behind the world of classical physics that we live in at our size scale and go all the way down to the atomic world and consider the rules that dominate down there. So I want you to imagine an apple, but not a regular apple. I want you to imagine a quantum mechanical apple that can be both red and green at exactly the same time. It has both states. And this quantum mechanical apple can have a twin or a paired apple that has this link with it, and we consider those two apples to be entangled. So the idea is that when you observe one of those apples to see what state it's in at that moment, the other apple would instantly take the opposite state. It would be in the opposite state. And that connection, that link between those two entangled quantum apples would be true even if they were separated at opposite ends of the universe. So if you look at one and it's red, the other one would be green.
Quantum apples, is that a thing?
That's a very good point. It's not a thing. So these researchers that did this experiment actually used tiny diamonds. And these defects in the diamonds can trap electrons. So really they used the state of these tiny electrons. And they entangled them using light. And when they separated them across campus and made instantaneous measurements on those electrons, the entangled electrons, at the same instant, they found they always had the opposite state. They measured them again and again and again, and every time they had opposite states. So this experiment was really the best evidence for quantum entanglement, and it managed to close a bunch of loopholes that other researchers hadn't been able to figure out how to get around, basically making sure that the electrons couldn't have communicated or influenced each other in any other way.
Sorry, Einstein.
So how could this one day affect our daily lives?
Well, people are really excited about it because quantum entanglement could lead to perfectly secure communications and is another step closer to super powerful quantum computers.
So moving back into the big physical world, our number 2 story is about a really cool find. Susan, what is this find?
Anthropologists named a new species of hominin Homo Naledi this past year. A hominin is a relative of humans, and this particular one lived anywhere from 2 million years ago to 200,000 years ago. And they found a number of fossils, over 1,500 fossils, and they had a lot of questions answered and a lot of new questions arise.
So tell us a little bit about Homo Naledi. What did these animals look like, and how did their bodies compare to ours?
The scientists placed Homo naledi in the same genus as humans. We're Homo sapiens, and they are Homo naledi. And all members of the genus Homo walk primarily on 2 legs, so we know that they were bipedal walkers. They were about 5 feet tall, about 100 pounds as adults, so similar to humans today. We learned that their skull, though, and therefore their brain, was a bit smaller than ours, smaller than we expected to find in these great 2-legged walkers. But we also found that things like their hand and feet look a lot more like modern-day human hands and feet, and showed that, again, they're very good walkers, 2-legged walkers, and also they have hands that have smaller, delicate proportions than we expected, again, in such a small-brained animal.
And where did they find these fossils?
They were found in a pretty impressive cave just north of Johannesburg in South Africa. And I say it was a pretty impressive cave because it was not easy to get down this cave, only maybe 50 feet below ground. But at one point, the opening to get into the cave was only 8 inches wide. So it took a very special type of scientist, anthropologist, anatomist, climber, and thin person to get down into this fossil site.
So if it was so hard for these researchers to get to the fossils, how did the animals get there in the first place?
That's a great question, and one of the most interesting parts about this find, that geologists believe that the cave never had any other entrances aside from this one narrow opening, and they believe that through process of elimination and through other evidence that these Homo Naledi fossils, or the bones at the time, were placed there by other members of Homo Naledi. So basically it was deliberate disposal of these bodies, of these bones, by other members of their species, which is really interesting to see this higher level of social complexity in such a small-brained animal. And now the number one science story of 2015. Eric, what was it?
New Horizons finally arrived at the dwarf planet Pluto in July after a journey of 9.5 years and 3 billion miles.
So what did we learn from New Horizons?
Basically, everything we found so far has been completely unexpected. The scientists had ideas of what we thought we might find on Pluto, and we're finding things that we never even dreamed of. So we have icy mountains about the size of the Rocky Mountains here on the Earth, made completely of frozen water. We have plains of frozen nitrogen. We're getting results about Pluto's very thin atmosphere that tells us a lot about the early atmosphere of the Earth. We're also seeing not as many craters as we would expect. We thought that Pluto would be peppered with craters like the Moon and lots of other bodies in the solar system, but we're seeing that they get erased on Pluto, just like they do here on the Earth, and we don't know any mechanism to explain that. And so that's some of the most exciting things that we get from these missions when we have a new mystery that we have to unravel by looking even further into all the data.
So is New Horizons done, or are we going to get any more data from it as it continues its forever journey into space?
It is never coming back to the Earth. We're going to spend another 9 months or so getting all of the Pluto data back, and then it's hopefully going to be able to fly by another smaller body even further out in the solar system around 2019.
Wow, that's out of this world.
That has been the top 10 science stories of 2015.
Happy New Year!
That's it for this week's show, but be sure to come back next time for more of the latest in science and technology. This podcast is a production of Current Science and Technology at the Museum of Science in Boston, part of the Boston community for over 175 years. For more information, visit our website at www.mos.org/CST or email us at podcast@mos.org. Thanks for listening.